the landscape of funding for development is considerably more complex today than it was 10 years ago. Over the past year, through these Insight events, we've looked at a variety of financial instruments and innovations. We've looked at blended finance, impact investing, guarantees, social finance. Today, we're going to consider the place of venture philanthropy and how that fits in the landscape. Venture philanthropy is actually a term that we heard a lot of maybe some 10 years ago, but has fallen a little in disfavor. So we're going to look at what that used to mean and how it's evolved over the time. We're joined by Dr. Frank Aswani, CEO of the African Venture Philanthropy Association, or AVPA. Frank began his career at Eli Lilly, where he rose to be sales director for South Africa and director for Sub-Saharan Africa. And he's complemented that commercial background with senior roles at the Africa Leadership Academy and at ARC, an international children's charity. So welcome, Frank. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you to the audience. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So let's start out. I mean, what is this venture philanthropy? It's been a long time since we've heard about this. And tell us about AVPA and what you've been doing for the last 10 years.
Colin, I was kind of hoping you didn't ask me what venture philanthropy is, but nonetheless, when people talk about venture philanthropy, it's seen as a high engaging long-term approach towards impact, where philanthropists will tend to support a social purpose organization in the long haul, usually deploying philanthropy, but also non-financial support so that they can maximize impact. Not so much financial return, but maximize impact. As AVPA, our focus on venture philanthropy has totally shifted because the world is demanding different solutions. So we work right across the continuum of capital, working with deployers of grants, debt, and equity towards impact, helping them not just to mobilize capital, but also to deploy it for maximum impact. We are in a situation whereby, as you know, we have more problems than we have resources to solve the issues that we're facing. And it's demanding innovation in how we approach and mobilize capital and also deploy the capital. So what AVPA does, it aims to fundamentally, the problem we're trying to solve is how do we close the social financing gap in Africa? If you use the SDGs as a framework, you know, we're facing about $500 billion to $1.2 trillion annual gap between now and 2030. And traditionally, that money has come from aid and government funding. And we know, for example, the UK aid budget to Africa has shrunk significantly, and our governments are running broke, as seen by the rising public debt to GDP. So what AVPA does is to try and think creatively about how we could mobilize capital and fundamentally look at how the private sector can play an increasingly leading role in funding social investments. So we do that by bringing investors together, connecting them to each other. We have a Dealshare platform in which we connect investors to each other, but also deal with this issue of many investors saying that there's more capital in Africa than there are investable opportunities. So on the Dealshare platform, we showcase a lot of investable opportunities across the continent. And because AVPA is an investor-only network, all the deals on our Dealshare platform can only be listed there by an existing investor in the deal. So investees cannot list themselves. The deals there have to be listed by an existing investor in the deal. And then we also do some research. So we've done like a landscape study looking at social investors across the continent. We also are creating thematic platforms which aggregates investors around a specific theme. So the first thematic platform we have is a gender platform. And lastly, we do capacity building programs, which I'll talk about in a bit later.
So let me ask you a question about this Deal platform, because what we've heard in other events, and this may be from the top down, but we often hear this statement that the problem in Africa is not capital. The problem is that there are not enough deals. But you've got a unique way of looking at this problem, really from the bottom up. So do you take issue with that generally accepted belief?
There is some truth to it, for sure. And partially it comes from a state of unconscious incompetence. People don't know they don't know. Many of our people who are supporting SMEs are not connected to the follow-on investors to understand what exactly do I need to be doing with my SME today to get them ready to be able to connect to the following investor. So we've got a lot of really entrepreneurial people on the continent, but I think that state of not knowing what it takes to attract following capital is hindering us from attracting more capital in this space. And that's why we do the Dealshare platform. But there's also some education that needs to happen on the investor side to understand what's unique about the African entrepreneur. When you're coming in to invest in an African entrepreneur, what are the things you need to think about, the challenges they face, the risks they're having to manage, the kind of environment in which they are playing in. So I think it demands a bit of compromise from both sides, but also education from both sides.
Yeah, I mean, AFPA has been on a great journey over the last 10 years. But I'm wondering if you could, I mean, what do you think we could do differently going forward to bridge that gap? Because what you're suggesting is, yeah, people don't know the deals that are actually there, and the deals that are there can't get the attention of the investors in London and Berlin and so forth. Any ideas about ways that we can bridge that? I mean, you spoke about education, but are there things that we can do with capital or with finance?
Absolutely correct. There's definitely a lot we can do with capital finance. I think we can restructure capital and finance differently. So let me give you a case in point. If you look at the opportunity behind gender-lens investing in Africa, it's a $360 billion opportunity. Gender-lens investing is no longer a nice to do. There's actually a really good business case behind it. But today, as an African woman, if you went to borrow money from a bank, it will demand you to bring collateral, like a title deed for land or whatever. And in many countries, women are not allowed to own land. So how can we kind of really package that energy that women bring? Because Africa has much more, a higher percentage of women entrepreneurs than you have male entrepreneurs. How do we generalize, take that energy that women bring and help them propel them to greatness? And I think financial institutions, for example, need to think differently about how they assess the credit worthiness of a woman business person. And there's a lot of innovation coming through in that space. Now people are looking at psychometric tests, for example. People are looking at revenue-based models. So there's definitely a space for capital deployers to think differently about how they deploy capital for impact.
Before we leave this point, maybe we can kind of draw back and take a very big view here. I mean, often we think about how finance can translate into economic development for Africa. And we've had people come on these events and hypothesize different routes to economic growth, investing in infrastructure, investing in financial institutions. And I wonder whether, I mean, you've got a unique look on this. What do you think is the role of finance for, African economic growth?
I think the role of finance for me is to see how it can create sustainable economic growth and what are the models that it needs to follow. Okay, we need to stop thinking about dealing with the symptoms of the problem and start addressing the root causes of some of the economic challenges we face. So, for example, you look at the case in point around the whole challenge now where we're trying to look at impact investing in Africa. And Africa, for me, is the impact sandbox of the world. There's no better place for an impact investor to be than in Africa. If you're not in Africa as an impact investor, you're not playing. This is like, it's like trying to play a Champions League game on a Sunday football pitch. You've got to be playing at Wembley, and Africa is a Wembley of impact. and for me, when you start thinking about those things, is to ask ourselves, okay, so what's holding Africa back? What's holding capital deployment in Africa back? And the best way for us to do this is to have Africans who've lived the problem to live the solution. But how do we enable them become better at living the solution? And if you look at things like capabilities, we are still very stuck in the old ways of solving our problems. Even we as Africans, one of the things as AVPA we're trying to change is to say, we've got to move away from that mindset that social issues can only be solved by grants, okay? Because we need to be thinking about sustainable financing and sustainable impact. And some of our social issues have commercial opportunity. They have commercial IP that can create more sustainable market solutions. And we should not be shy to start challenging our own mindset. We need to start challenging mindsets, for example, like the private sector has no role to play in social investments. COVID has taught us that it's our business to keep societies healthy and vibrant. Otherwise, our own commercial customer base will be eroded. So there's a real place for us to think creatively about a new way of driving social impact that is inclusive, that is purpose-driven, that mainstreams the thinking about the involvement of both traditional philanthropic capital and private capital.
And last year, you started, I think, something called the Impact Investing Fellowship. I mean, that sounds like, is that part of this effort to change kind of the way that people think about the role of finance in social, social efforts? Or tell us a bit more about that fellowship.
So we're in a really weird situation. I mean, if I was to look at the US as, say, the US or the UK is the biggest vehicle market in the world, yet imagine a situation whereby the US or the UK does not have enough vehicle engineers to produce vehicles. That's our case in Africa. We have the biggest impact opportunities, but we don't have enough competent impact practitioners in this space. Did you know that the whole continent of Africa has only one institution of learning with an innovative financing program? If you want to learn innovative finance or impact investing in Africa, you have one choice. That's the University of Cape Town. Okay, and it's positioned in probably arguably one of Africa's biggest economies. So it's not even sufficient to deal and serve South Africa, leave alone the rest of the continent. So if we want to learn about impact investing and innovative finance, we've got to come to Oxford, Cambridge, Duke, Stanford, and the pound is strong to many African currencies. It costs us a lot to do that. So how do we develop a critical mass of competent impact investing practitioners across Africa who know how to work across grants, debt, and equity for maximum impact? And for that purpose, one of the things we realize is if we're to deal with the root causes, we've got to build a critical mass of competent impact investing practitioners on the continent. So that's why we ran that program. And it's one of many that we need to do to get Africa moving forward. So we are looking at some really exciting opportunities. That program was really successful. We were very grateful to have partnered with faculty from the Oxford Side Business School for that program. On the back of that, we've been asked by a partnership with Boehringer and Ashoka to do one just for healthcare investors, for African healthcare investors. We are also looking to do an exciting program to bring together and capacitate about 30 or 40 African business schools to enable them to set up their own departments of innovative finance. And for that, we're working with a global consortium called the Impact Investing and Sustainable Finance Consortium. This is about 80 business schools who teach impact investing and sustainable finance. And it's the usual suspects. As I said, mentioned Harvard, Yale, Duke, Oxford, Stanford. There's not a single African business school in that consortium, not one. Okay. And one of the benefits of being in that consortium is all the curriculum is made open source. So imagine being able to teach in Lagos, in Nairobi, in Kinshasa, in Accra, using Harvard, Yale, or Oxford curriculum. But also imagine the benefits that Oxford, Yale, Stanford, or Duke could get from having really good impact case studies from Africa, because there's no better place you can get impact case studies than Africa. So there's a really good symbiotic relationship that we can build here at a global impact level. And so we also have to think about governments. This whole impact space is one where we cannot afford to leave governments behind. Okay. One, they'll not create the right enabling environment for us to thrive and change the space. Two, governments sit on probably the largest and most important chunk of money to de-risk and serve as catalytic capital. If we could get African governments to deploy their capital differently, imagine how much private capital we can unlock. So there's so much upside in this space if we get the education and training of our impact investing space right.
So one thing we've been investigating through these inside events is kind of novel ways that development finance institutions or other traditional development actors how they can change. Because what we've learned is we're in a space of rapid financial innovation, especially in Africa. So with that background, I mean, what is it that, can DFIs help in this shift? You've been talking about education, but is there something that, CDC or FCDO can do to help you make that educational shift?
Absolutely. And I think DFIs underestimate the power they've got. But before I talk about DFIs, let me take a step back and just talk about grant philanthropists, for example, or aid agencies.
Yeah.
I think the grant funding of today needs to think a bit differently. It needs to be thinking, I'm coming into a space where there isn't enough money to fund the problem that we have. How do I use my money cleverly? How do I make my $1 unlock $10 of other funding? How do I magnify my impact? So I think there's a really nice and emerging role for philanthropists and grant money today to be more risk-taking, to test new products, new markets, new services. Okay, I think philanthropists should be the ones taking some of that initial high risk, funding some of your more innovative, for example, SMEs at stages when they can't attract private capital. I think there's a really interesting place where philanthropists should take a lot more risk in identifying or pushing through to proof of concepts, really interesting models and approaches and products that can then be scaled for impact. So that's the first thing. When it comes then to DFIs, absolutely. By the definition, you're development finance institutions, but sometimes you behave almost like private banks. You don't take as much risk as you should, for example. When you come to Africa, you want to do and not to enable. I think DFIs should be asking themselves, how are we not just doing, but how are we enabling? Okay, it's a cold, chilly night on Africa. Our wood is ready, we need to light it. And then you come and light your own fire, and in the morning you will put out your fire and leave. You've not left us any better. How are you enabling us to be able to solve our own problems better? And I think there's a space for DFIs to kind of take that next level of risk. There's a space for DFIs to fund a lot more capacity building in our countries, in our spaces, and see themselves as catalytic investors, not so much as coming in like almost mainstream investors. There's a space for DFIs to support policy changes. So for example, in Africa, there's probably 2 or 3 countries where if you supported a nonprofit with grants, you get tax returns. How do we change the policy and laws to evolve into meeting today's reality and today's needs? And there are a lot of lessons we can take from outside and from within the continent to be able to do that. How do you support, for example, government innovative financing programs to educate government officials on how to play in this new space? Because until we get governments, and that's why I think DFIs on a government-to-government level, until we get governments in Africa understanding this new space, there'll forever be barriers to success because they don't know. So there's a really huge space for DFIs. How are DFIs changing models of financing, move away from kind of balance sheet financing to things like revenue-based financing, so we can test new models and approaches. So I think you underestimate the influence and leadership that you have. You underestimate your ability to stimulate mobilization of large pools of capital. I'd love to see CDC and DFC collaborate to set up and see if they can set up large pools, for example, of catalytic pools of funding to de-risk social investments and support TA. So I think it takes a bit more courage from you guys, and you need to be asking yourselves, what are we going to do differently? What's the legacy we want to build? How are we going to enable Africa to take care of itself and not necessarily be the ones who we come in, do stuff and then leave, and not necessarily leave Africa as better than we found them?
Great answer, and certainly a challenge for us. Following up on that, though, I mean, we all know that we're looking at a huge gap in either capital or investments. It doesn't really matter, to achieve the 2030 goals. And some people say it's 500 billion, some people say it's 1 trillion. Let's just agree it's an extremely large sum of money. Yes. And I'm always curious to ask people who come on, how do you think we're going to bridge that? I mean, how much of that gap should be made up by African investment from Africa? How much should be kind of investment from commercial investors kind of in the West, just looking at investable opportunities? How much is impact investors? How much is DFIs? I mean, how do we kind of build something up to bridge that large number? And where should we be focusing our efforts?
Colin, if I had an answer to that question, I wouldn't be here. You ask a really good question, but a really difficult question as well. I don't know, to be honest, but what I know, we should not be standing still. We should be out there experimenting and trying out new approaches because our old ones are not working. If you look back at how we've been trying to fund this space through aid and government funding, it hasn't worked. We haven't built sustainable development. In many cases, aid has left African countries worse than they've been in the 60s. Some of us have worse living standards than our parents did. The bottom line, we need to look at doing something different. What I know for sure is that we're at a stage where we're smarter, we've got more options, and we need to be looking at different possibilities. And this is where we need to try and ask ourselves, how are we testing new models of trying to solve this problem sustainably? You're right, the size is growing. Our age in Africa is 19, compared to, I think the UK is mid to late 40s, Japan is 51. We are adding 1 million people a month into the continent, into the job market every year. We're supposed to have created pre-COVID 12 million jobs a year. We're only doing 3 million jobs a year. We're running a 9 million job deficit annually. Something different needs to be done. And I think as we look at some of this stuff, is to start thinking differently. So you ask about how much should be done through local private capital. I'm a big believer that if we start getting creative with things like blending capital, it is so much better for us if we use and unlock local private capital, sitting in pension funds, in corporates, because it doesn't come with all the other things that Forex comes with, exchange rate risks and those kind of things. And local private investors understand our spaces better. So once again, how does external catalytic capital come and help de-risk and unlock local private capital? That for me is a more sustainable path than trying to bring in all these dollars from the outside. But we know there's probably not enough, but we've got to start somewhere, in my view. So I don't have a concrete or right or wrong answer for you. But what I know is we need to be trying out new things. We need to be experimenting, testing new models, trying to get to proof of concept of some of these things we're trying to do.
Great.
And scaling how we can, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you one more question and then we'll go to questions. But if I can just ask anyone who's listening who has a question, please use the Q&A button that should be appearing at the bottom of your screen. Post your question and we'll try and deal with it in the second half of our event today. So my last question is, we're always talking about challenges. I mean, this huge gap. You talk about, the average youth of Africa, but in all of this, there's also opportunities. I mean, Africa has a remarkably young workforce, where a lot of countries in Western Europe, for example, or Japan, have just older and older workforces. And you mentioned the entrepreneurial spirit that you see in Africa. So, where there's a capital shortage, there actually are a lot of great ideas knocking around. So I wonder if you could finish off with a kind of a more, your thoughts, crystal ball. How do you see, the African future over maybe the next 10 years? What's going to happen, do you think, in Africa as we get to 2030?
I'm a total Afro optimist, and I'm really proud to be an African and to live on this continent. And the question I always want to be able to respond to my kids is that, did it matter that I was born and bred in this continent? It didn't matter. I came to work in the UK and I spent 3 years there. And typical at that age of 25, I left Kenya saying, I'm never coming back. When I go to England, I thought, but the UK doesn't need me. There's enough Brits to solve Britain's problems. We need people like me coming back to Africa and owning our problems. And so when you think about the opportunities in Africa, they're massive, okay? You think of what if we got our education right with all the young people that we were getting? What if, imagine the kind of human capital we can unleash onto the world. Capital that, as the UK, Europe is facing an aging population, you can buy into. Markets that would buy European and American goods. Markets that would, talent that will produce African goods for export. Okay, all these things about people crossing the Mediterranean should become a thing of the past the next 5 years. I'm ashamed, to be honest with you, as an African, to see my people cross the continent, the Mediterranean. We failed our people. Okay, the opportunity in Africa is huge. And if you think about even from an impact investing space, there's no better place for you to come and test some of your impact models in Africa. Look at how pay-as-you-go models with solar equipment has happened. People are making money while doing good. Another thing we're trying to challenge is you can still deliver impact at a very cheap and affordable purpose. Africans are not shy to pay for good products and good services. Okay, you look at the pay-as-you-go model in solar, a lot of companies in Africa are making a lot of money while offering really good services, having climate change impact through pay-as-you-go solar models. You think about one of the joys about Africa, in many places, innovation precedes regulation. If you want to come and test some of your real innovation, come to Africa. Look at what Zipline has done in Rwanda, now using drones to transport medicine and blood. Look at M-Pesa. In many places in the West or in the North, M-Pesa would have been stifled by regulation. Okay, and look at the impact that M-Pesa has had on mobile money globally, and just the use of the cell phone. Okay, so if you want to innovate, there's no better place than Africa. You'll have good spaces, you'll have exciting challenges you need to try. And they always say, if your innovation can succeed on the extreme users, it will work anywhere. And there's no better place where you can get extreme users than in Africa. You will have talent. There are more Africans going to school today than ever before, graduating from university than ever before. We are having better democracy. Is it perfect? No, but it's much better than it's ever been. Our challenges today are not things for us to be embarrassed about. They're actually the glass is half full, not half empty, like it used to be. Okay, so I'm super excited about what we can do in Africa. Why I do what I do is because we can do it differently. We can do it more sustainably, we can do it at scale, and we can do it faster.
Fantastic, inspirational. So let's go and get some questions now. So the first one is a question about fragile and complex states. And there's been an increasing attention on the sort of handful of countries that have experienced persistently low economic growth. I don't know what the full list is, but it certainly has Central African Republic and DRC on it. So, and the question is, how much focus should we be placing on those extreme environments? And can we use the same tools in those extreme environments?
So it's very interesting about that question, Colin, because it tends to be the bias that many people view Africa with. Okay, people forget that for many years, in almost 8 of your top 10 fastest growing economies in the world were African. Let's talk about the opportunities in those 8 out of 10. When we talk about Europe, no one talks about the war in Kosovo, for example, or what it was in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, for example. Why should the same lens be applied to Africa? There's so much better and so much more we can talk about Africa. Okay, and now there's great stuff. We've got a free trade agreement. People looking for scalable opportunities to grow their businesses beyond one country should be talking about how do we maximize some of those transformation changes that are happening. So before we go and talk about the bad of Africa, I'd like to spend time talking about the good of Africa. And there's plenty. There is plenty. We're seeing, look at how many more unicorns are coming out of Africa today than there were 10 years ago. Look at how we're growing our financial inclusion space and the fintech space. So I really would like us to challenge our own biases in how we would approach Africa. Take a step back and just ask yourself about your own biases, especially someone who's not in Africa, and ask yourself, there are a lot of happy people in this continent, a lot of people making money on this continent, a lot of people creating change on this continent. What are they getting right? How are they viewing opportunity on this continent? Who can I come and co-invest with? Where do I start? Okay, and like any risk metrics, you won't go to the fragile states first. You'll be stupid to do that. There's a lot more good opportunity, and I'd like us to change our mindset from that perspective.
So a very insightful answer to that question. Thank you. I feel I have to say I raised it first simply because it was the first question, but so second question is, you've touched a bit on the challenges that African startups and entrepreneurs have in identifying capital. And there's one question, I suppose, from a startup that says, what advice, can you give? What is the roadmap for an African startup that needs capital?
I think is to work backwards. If you're going to be looking for capital, first of all, understand what is the capital looking for, and how do I measure up against what the capital is looking for. So and also I think it's very important, and this is where some of the education comes in. What is a different type of capital I need at different types of my life cycle of my business? When should I be looking for grants? And how do I use those grants? And at the end of that grant cycle, how am I ready for the follow-on investor? Because sometimes I think we don't think about us being on a journey. And a journey to greatness means you've got to be preparing for the next step at all times. So I think, first of all, work backwards and understand, where are you in your life cycle of your startup? What kind of capital do you need? What does a capital provider look for when he's funding someone like me? Who can give me the help to get me ready for that, investor ready for that type of investor? And then look into your ecosystem, because one of the things we also believe in is that it's just not financial capital that is required to make this space work and explode. We also need to look at non-financial support. It's just as important as financial support. Okay, and one of the things we do at AVPA, our network of investors provide financial, human, and intellectual capital, because we recognize that human intellectual capital is just as important as financial capital.
And when we talk about impact investing, here's a question for you. I mean, when you think of impact investing in Africa, do you believe that it must be concessionary finance? Or do you think, which is the traditional hope of investors, that you can both have impact and have market level profitability? Or do we just have to accept that it's going to be concessionary?
No, we don't have to accept that it's going to be concessionary. I think there's a whole continuum of risk returns you can get on the continent. But what we're trying to change is that Africa is not just that place that can only take concessionary capital. There's huge opportunities for people who are looking for both impact and financial returns. And we're seeing many people who've made it, as I mentioned to you, people who are doing solar kits for villages in Africa. They have adopted pay-as-you-go models that are working very, very well. And there's many more types of examples that are available. So, and that's part of the mindset we've got to change, both for the investor and for Africans. Africans need to change the fact that any money that comes from the West has to be free. Okay, and the investors have to change the fact that you can't make money in Africa. Times have really changed, and we'll support you to make sure that we can get the right opportunities to deliver both impact and financially acceptable financial returns. You might not make the massive returns, but you'll make acceptable financial returns. And as I mentioned to you, profit with purpose is something I think we should try to mainstream now. Capital has to be seeking to be more than just about making profit. And there's no better place, I believe, to be able to test some of those models than in Africa.
So we've got a great question from an NGO here in the UK called Publish What You Fund. And Gary Forster, who's been working there, has been pushing DFIs like CDC to provide a lot more information about our investments and about the risks that we're taking. And one of the theories behind that is that if DFIs provided more information about their investments, it would make it easier for commercial investors to invest in Africa. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, listen, I think perceptions are reality. That's one thing we must admit. So I definitely think data and information is a very important part of any investor making a decision about where to go. But I'd encourage a lot of the NGOs or anyone who's looking to invest in Africa, not just to take the one-sided perception or about risk and those kind of things. Come and talk to there are a lot of Africans and a lot of Europeans who are investing in Africa. What is their view of the risk and how they're mitigating and managing it? There's incremental ways in which that is being done a lot easier. One of, as you mentioned, Colin, is the use of concessionary capital, and there are many other ways. So I think there's two sides to every story. So in as much as you're doing your due diligence, yes, by all means, listen to the DFIs and those kind of people, but also tap into networks like ours, where there are tons of investors making a lot of money in Africa and creating change, and understand what have they learned over time, because they do business in these ecosystems and in these spaces, and they've done it well for years, and then make an informed decision.
Okay. I mean, in the eve of COP26, I mean, we can't really have a conversation about finance without talking about climate change. And so there's a question about your thoughts about climate change and what Africa, the role of Africa and African finance and Africa paths of economic growth that can help the climate change roadway that we're all going to have to find a way through.
Yeah, you know, the sad thing is that Africa is probably one of the biggest victims of climate change, but one of the least contributor to climate impact, climate degradation. So we're in a really precarious situation in many places, whereby the kind of economic growth we require, you know, and if you look at this, the progress that a lot of the West and Northern countries made through the industrial ages, it was accompanied with a lot of environmental and climate degradation. So the kind of actions are being made to take right now in going green, for example, you know, a country like South Africa, which produces a lot of electricity from coal, is being asked to close down a lot of its coal plants, but alternatives are few and far between. And there isn't the funding to support that transition to clean energy, for example. So I think there's a role to play whereby the West has to think about what will it cost Africa to be compliant, and what's the opportunity cost of that? Because if we have to do this, and this is just a reality check, I think if we've got to do this well, how much of our resources is it taking compared to what we need to do with other things? And funny enough, if you look at the SDGs that we are on course to achieve, there's 2 that Africa is on course to achieve of the 17 pre-COVID, and one of them is climate change. The impact of climate, and the other one I think was SDG 12. So we're not doing badly from that perspective, but I think if we're not big emitters in Africa, for example, our emissions are minuscule compared to the West, and you know, a lot of pressure is being put on us to go green, but generally we're not doing badly, to be honest with you. I think the question is, can we still play a leading role in making sure that we don't add to the emissions, for sure, that are existing? But I think we'll need some support to make sure that we can still produce enough energy, for example, to fuel the continent, and do it cost effectively. The good thing is that we've got a lot of natural resources, anything from gas to the sun, and how do we make use of the sun, for example, to fuel Africa? But the reality, we know, to try and, for example, run a country on on solar is hard. The base load is not enough. But maybe we look at other things like wind and geothermal. So that's a very difficult question, because there are trade-offs you've got to make in this process. But hopefully people understand the challenges that Africa has to face in making decisions around this.
Now, we posted a link to the Dealshare platform, and apparently some people are already multitasking and have visited it. So we have a question here about if you can give some further color on how the Dealshare platform has actually worked, and what have been some of the challenges and what have been maybe some of the successes about how it's mobilized investors.
Okay, so the Dealshare platform, as I mentioned to you, is trying to address this issue of especially non-African investors who have an interest in Africa, struggling to find investable pipeline. And we are telling them, no, actually, we can help you with that particular process. So we seek investable opportunities in Africa and list them on the Dealshare platform. It's still very new. It's just over a year old, and we're trying to learn and beef it up as we go along. And we've modeled it on the one from our Asian sister network, AVPN. So part of the challenges we're facing on there is, for example, is to get a critical mass of impact, not just any investors, impact investors who truly want to deliver impact. Because when you look at the definition of impact, I mean, our definition of impact is that some people argue, oh, but if I build a any investment in Africa creates impact. But the question we ask is there additionality and intentionality? If you're going to build a factory in Nairobi or in Johannesburg or Lagos, private capital would have gone there anyway, without any incremental efforts. But if you're going to go into the middle of into Kano or Jos in Nigeria, or in the Umtata in South Africa, in the middle of Kenya, to build a rural factory, you're being additional and intentional about where you're creating those jobs. Okay, and trying to get impact investors to think, to understand that we appreciate your investment, yes, but how much additionality and intentionality are you actually having in your investment is very important. So whatever we list on there is something that really deserves to be on the platform. So there's a bit of work we need to do there. The other thing we're struggling with is still the challenge of education around how do we tailor financing, as we've spoken before, for the different types of investments in there. So when should an investment on the platform ask for a grant and not rush to ask for, let's say, debt or equity? We've got a big funnel of deals that want to be listed, but they're not investor ready. And in Africa, we do need people. If you're listening to this and you do any investment readiness program, please talk to us, because we need to start looking for really scalable programs that drive large-scale investor readiness of our SMEs. And especially in this COVID world, if something we can do virtually would be really phenomenal. Because there's a lot of really good investments that I just need some help and some technical assistance funding to get them over the line, so that we can then post them on the Dealshare platform. So that kind of stuff. And then also we find that in some cases from the supply side of capital, some investors have just unrealistic expectations. You know, they come and they want to get the normal rates of returns that private investors would get. So those are some of the challenges we're dealing with, but the ecosystem is kind of finding its way as we go along. Great.
I mean, you spoke with particular passion about the issue around gender investing, which is a space where, I mean, CDC has tried to be active. We have one question from someone who asked whether you think that the fastest route to get more money into the hands of female entrepreneurs is to have female-led fund managers.
That is a fantastic question. It's a fantastic question. In short, yes. Okay. And so as we talk about some of the capabilities and enabling things DFIs could do, is to come and address some of those root causes. Is how can we get more first-time fund managers developed in Africa across the board, but especially female first-time fund managers. That is definitely one of the things we need to be thinking about, because as a woman looking for money, you get very different empathy and perception from a room where it's just men, or where there are women in that room making a decision. So I totally agree with that. Is we need to build this basic pool of first-time female fund managers if we're going to move the needle on genderless investing.
Right. And then finally, maybe just I'll ask this question, maybe a little guidance for CDC. I mean, you mentioned that you feel that DFIs are not catalyzing and simply kind of directly investing, and that we're kind of doing, if I'm not putting words in your mouth, the same old thing. So can you flesh that out a bit? What do you think that DFIs like CDC should do differently?
So I think is to ask yourself, what do we want to leave behind? At some point, you're going to have to leave. What do we want to leave behind? We want to leave a more capable Africa. We want to leave a more competent set of Africans. We want to leave more impact that we ever imagined. We want to preferably leave impact that's African, catalyzed by you, but driven by Africans. Okay, those are some of the things I think you need to be asking yourself. And how are you, in working backwards, doing, and what are you doing now to make that happen? Okay, are you going to Africa and investing with a UK partner in Africa? How is that helping us build our own capabilities? And that really is what drives me mad. Is you come, in many cases, the money comes here, and the partner that a DFI chooses is someone from their country. you're not helping build our own capabilities. How are we helping making sure that the money we're deploying gets to local founders of businesses and not expatriate founders? Okay, how are we making sure that we're strengthening systems and governments to be able to support the growth of this space? Because one of the things about impact investing through the various approaches is we're getting much more accountability of where money goes. If you look at things like outcome-based financing, we get much more connection between capital and impact. Okay, there's less waste of capital. How are we helping change the way capital is deployed so that the return on impact for every dollar or every pound spent is higher? That's the legacy you need to be asking yourself. And I think if you look at your scorecard, you need to take a really good, honest look at yourself and say, have we created a better space for your African investors and a result for the African themselves? Okay, have we left Africa a better place from a regulatory perspective? Is it easier for even our own investors from Europe to come and invest in Africa based on the work that we've done with African governments? And also based on the fact that we've built an ecosystem of local investors who can invest with any other investors from across the world. Okay, we've built universities that are doing research, capabilities that have now, they can do research, they can build, they can support policy refinement. Those are the questions I think we need to be asking. Otherwise, the whole old model of coming to do something and claim and take kudos for building infrastructure, road and whatever, whereas it was good, it wasn't catalytic. You just did that one project and that was it. How are we really being catalytic, and how are we being deliberate about strengthening the capabilities within the ecosystem broadly?
And I don't think there's a better place that we could maybe close down our discussion today than that. I think that was you know, a really great answer. There are a few questions here that we did not get to ask, but I'll just assure everyone that we'll make sure that all of them have been passed along to Frank, and maybe we'll be able to answer some of them in writing later. I mean, I'm going to struggle here to summarize this because it's rare that we've had so wide-ranging a conversation. But at the end, I think what you've presented is an enormously optimistic and yet realistic view of the interplay of financial innovation and economic growth in Africa. And what Frank's described for us is a place where there is financial innovation and financial opportunity everywhere. I particularly like the phrase, which I will steal, of describing Africa as the Wembley Stadium of impact investing. I mean, this is a place of business opportunity, and especially of business opportunities for those who want to do well while making money. So, but at the same time, implicit in that is this challenge to traditional development actors like DFIs to do something different. And I think it's a fair criticism to say that, you know, for many countries, and I accept that we should not always focus on the countries of challenge in Africa, but also recognize those ones of great growth. But for a lot of places in Africa, as you said, your generation is worse off than those of your parents or even of your grandparents. So something isn't working. Something has to be changed. And I think you've laid down a very clear challenge to development actors across the development framework to do something different. So it's been an extraordinarily fruitful hour. I want to thank you. One of the unfortunate parts of doing this online is that you only get a virtual round of applause, but I can guarantee you that it is a deafening virtual round of applause. So thank you very much, Frank. Thank you very much, everyone who's tuned in to listen to this. I look forward to talking with you in the future as we do more of these Insight events in 2022. And until then, have a good day. Thank you.